The more a theory lays claim to universal validity, the less capable it is of doing justice to the individual facts. Any theory based on experience is necessarily statistical. That is to say, it formulates an ideal average which abolishes all exceptions at either end of the scale and replaces them by an abstract mean. This mean is quite valid, though it need not necessarily occur in reality. Despite this, it figures in the theory as an unassailable, fundamental fact. The exceptions at either extreme, though equally factual, do not appear in the final result at all, since they cancel each other out. If, for instance, I determine the weight of each stone on a bed of pebbles and get an average weight of 145 grams, this tells me very little about the real nature of the pebbles. Anyone who thought, on the basis of these findings, that he could pick up a pebble of 145 grams at the first try would be in for a serious disappointment. Indeed, it might well happen that however long he searched, he would not find a single pebble weighing exactly 145 grams. The statistical method shows the facts in the light of the ideal average, but does not give us a picture of their empirical reality. While reflecting an indisputable aspect of reality, it can falsify the actual truth in a most misleading way. This is particularly true of theories which are based on statistics. The distinctive thing about real facts, however, is their individuality. Not to put too fine a point on it, one could say that the real picture consists of nothing but exceptions to the rule, and that, in consequence, absolute reality has predominantly the character of irregularity. Carl Gustav Jung, in an excerpt from The Undiscovered Self.
Got him!
I'll be tackling both consensus opinion and objective ratings here, since they are in actual practice one and the same. If someone mentions a consensus opinion, well, they obviously mean the consensus opinion, or a mean/average score. If they mention an objective rating allegedly somehow detached from that aggregate of individual scores, on the other hand, they're either unknowingly referring back to that aggregate rating once again, or they're referring to some relative numerical rating derived from a formula of further reductive ratings of various disparate elements which theoretically make up the relative sum value of the work, relative, of course, to how other pieces of art are rated by said system or formula. While quite obviously many shows elicit experiences greater than the sum of their parts, and it's impossible to grade those elements without involving at least one fallible human, it's also always going to be built off of a formula based on, once again, a consensus of how those various elements should be separated or combined, how they should be weighted relative to each other, exactly how they should be graded, etc. No matter how you slice it, you end up back at an arbitrary average of a bunch of random opinions, or even worse, organized and therefore leading opinions. There are many ways to approach this, but I think there is one key reason why consensus opinions and objective numerical ratings for shows not only don't make sense, but are also generally far less useful than we like to pretend. We, as individuals, weigh the value of different elements in such works differently, and in some cases, even perceive how they're grouped or divided differently. For example, is direction a part of animation? What about art style and character design? They certainly influence the final product of animation, however, in most animation processes, they're born from separate minds, and are certainly not tied to the final animation as closely as something like keyframe animation. Same with characters, world building, and story. Where does one end and another begin? Is architecture part of world building, or art style, etc.? Are we more accurate in grade to weight all of these conceptual elements individually, or to combine the dozens of various elements into 5 to 10 essential core elements as convention tends to be for quote-unquote experts? Undeniably, watching one of Best Guy Ever's recent videos, Thematic versus technical storytelling slowly brought me back around to this topic. He basically illustrates this. The viewer of an artistic story either values the consistency and logic of moment-to-moment technical minutia, literal events, in a story more, or they value the themes and ideas portrayed and supported by said events in a story more.
Both is good.
Depending on which side of this fence you land on, you will consume media differently and likely consume different media altogether. If you fall on the side of thematic storytelling, perhaps you grew up enjoying fairy tales, where portraying compelling themes and narrative structures took precedence over telling stories with consistent and logical through lines in the literal events of the story. And perhaps now you never tire of shonen fights where friendship and justice always win out over the logic of who technically and theoretically should win a fight. This duality is certainly interesting and useful as a bridge for those of us with different priorities on storytelling to better understand our own and each other's opinions. But I think this also may leave out a certain subset, potentially the largest of the three. In fairness, it may be irrelevant to the analysis of storytelling in particular, but I believe there are quite a few fans of anime, art, and entertainment in general who simply prioritize spectacle and the so-called rule of cool over those two elements. And no, just for the record, I don't mean that to necessarily be an insult to the latter. But if it were, perhaps we could simply refer to them as spectacle tards. Some simply call them
Fucking normies!
The point is that we as individuals value different elements in the media we consume. We weigh those various elements differently in relation to each other. We may perceive what constitutes the nature of those specific elements differently, and we even perceive the division and grouping of many of the most obvious, various reductionary elements differently depending on, obviously, our perspectives, none of which can objectively be said is wrong. That's not even to get into the question of IRL context surrounding our experience with a show. Who we watched the show with, if anyone at all, whether or not any important synchronistic events in our life surrounded our first viewing, etc. For a more specific example, one of the main reasons I personally love Technolize, a niche old Madhouse production sharing its producer and character designers with Serial Experiments Lane, so much is because of its deep emphasis on the physical and the visual, and its ability to inform you through subtext and character action instead of exposition. Technolize provides almost no expository dialogue and asks that you pay constant and close attention to what happens physically, visually on screen, or you honestly won't have any idea what's happening. It challenges you to sit up, take your brain out of low power mode, and pay attention. And it also rewards you by burying all of the clues you need to figure out abstract and obscure little things like how its lore, technologies, and character-specific abilities work within the show, just almost never through exposition. It's kinda like the Dark Souls of anime in that sense. Alas, for likely most people, that's beyond even something like Evangelion's point on the straightforward writing spectrum, and therefore, friggin' boring. And I can empathize with why some people feel that way. Technolize is absolutely not for everyone, in any sense of that phrase.
I don't want children to consume this. Let's think about that as we move along.
On the opposite end, there's something like Demon Slayer, which obviously has mass appeal for its spectacle, technical proficiency, and graphic fidelity, which are at a level exceedingly rare for shonen thanks to Ufotable, the specific staff, composers, character designer, etc. People eat up the animation, the character designs, the exceptional direction during key episodes, the interesting ways multi-participant fights are framed, etc. And I totally get it. But Demon Slayer lies near the opposite end of the dialogue spectrum, and for me, in this specific case, that means every time I'm about to get lost in how awesome the fight is, Uzui starts expositing about flashiness, Daki starts seething about ugliness and beauty, Yutaro starts yelling about jealousy and envy again, and I'm immediately yanked out of the hype experience of what I value from the spectacle of it all by the show, in my opinion, repeatedly trying to overexpose the obvious and literal relation of these repeated tropes to the themes present in the entertainment district and all of the characters converging there. I don't think I'm the only one who feels that way, but obviously that opinion doesn't exactly show up in the statistics. On another front, there are folks like my man JBP, who specifically seem to value above all the question of whether or not the themes and moral ideas present in a piece of fiction are true in the real world, and whether those messages were reached through naturally unfolding, genuinely curious, and inquisitive methods. For example, chaos theory, the Socratic method, etc. Or whether those messages were reached through more propagandistic means, with the air of a writing style that seems to already know its conclusion from the onset and simply seeks a way to rationalize it by any means necessary, including the cheapest of emotional manipulation techniques.
How embarrassing.
My sense in reading the book is that he came to that conclusion and then wrote the book to justify it, which is actually the reverse of the way that you should write a book. What you should do when you're writing a book is you should have a question, and it should be a real question, right? It should be one you don't know the answer to. And then you should be studying and writing like mad and reading everything you can get your hands on to see if you can actually grapple with the problem and come to some solution. And you should walk the reader as well through your process of thinking so that they can come to not necessarily to the same conclusion, but at least track what you're doing. And I don't think that's what he did. I think he wrote it backwards.
And hey, more power to you, Dr. Peterson. As crazy as it sounds, I think he has some of the best analysis on YouTube in videos such as the Carl Jung and the Lion King lectures. And I can certainly see why it might be compelling to see this element as the end-all be-all to determine whether a fictional piece of literature is truly great and worthy of sharing with one's fellow humans or not. However, I disagree for a pretty simple reason. I've occasionally watched well-designed shows that seem to represent philosophies I disagreed with, and shockingly, I still enjoyed some of them.
It's a different world with different things going on. And so I just want to caution anyone to be too hasty at rushing to get real mad at a world that is very different from our own to apply some moral lens. And really the real mistake is applying a moral lens and trying to justify what these characters did in the way you would like you or a friend of yours in the real world right now. You can do that if you want to. My position is you're viewing anime wrong in general if you're doing that. And some anime is about a moral. Some anime is about watching role model characters. Others are not.
I've quote-unquote enjoyed shows where the bad guys won, or at least the good guys lost. I've even enjoyed shows where the bad guys are the good guys, because it's simply funny. And to touch on that quote-unquote enjoyed from before, even pure overall enjoyment by itself might be a naturally intuitive metric, but overall a bad indicator in some instances. I'm not sure if the sentence "I enjoyed Technolize" makes any sense at all if you've actually seen it. I had a slow-burning, painful, visceral, terrifyingly surreal, and compelling experience that shook me to my core watching Technolize, and I feel that was well worth my time and is an experience that will always stick with me? Sure. But did I enjoy it? No way, man. It basically physically hurts to watch to its conclusion.
Right, and hey, I'm sure there are shows that do mopey just fine. I can't think of any immediately. Technolize? That's a mopey show, right?
Yeah,
to say the least.
Pretty hard to watch.
I guess it really is the Dark Souls of anime. Or maybe I'm just a masochist. To put a fine tip on this point quickly, and because this script's length is quickly spiraling out of control, I'll just provide a few other quick thought experiments through questions. Do you place more value on an interesting and original premise for a story made to a passable standard, or the masterful execution of a very simple and perhaps even cliché one? Do you prefer a show that gives you clear messages on what is meant by the story through exposition, or one where those messages are left to subtext, hints, and methods such as rewarding characters for supposed moral virtues and punishing characters with alleged moral weaknesses and incompetencies? A show where one very obvious message is clearly portrayed, easily understood, and made masterfully compelling, or one where the psychology of characters is thoroughly fleshed out and a rich lore-filled world unfolds before you, but it's ultimately left up to you to decide which layer of the story's iceberg, so to speak, to consider the message. As for myself, I tend to have oddly specific tastes for my absolute favorites. They're usually either very heady sci-fi shows with coherent, logical through lines in both the technical and thematic department, or relaxing slice-of-life shows where there's no complex moral message in sight and anything goes logically, so long as there are chill vibes. Though it's certainly helpful if said chill anime shows some expertise in its particular topic, passion, character interest, etc. As for what I generally dislike, it's typically shows that make me feel like my time is being wasted, stories with boring repetitive dialogue, stories that break their own established rules, or have characters act stupid just because it's not time to progress the plot, shows with what I call thematic dissonance, or themes that feel less like moral grays and more like ideas that run at odds with each other, shows that don't pay off on the concepts they establish initially, shows that rely on cliffhangers to garner interest, shows devoid of thought-provoking concepts unless that's specifically the point, etc. And I'm sure I have my exceptions to every one of those rules, since the one true question is just, am I bored, or am I engaged emotionally and or mentally? But honestly, that's a topic for another video. Only relevant point being, what I like and dislike most is all over the place, and I think that only further illustrates my point. As for the reason I think many still attempt to formulate such methods for determining these values, I think it's often actually very much a relatable search for a better understanding of one's own opinions and quantifiably why one feels those feelings about those particular shows. I can totally relate as someone who longs for that perfect methodology, for that perfect list of which shows I think are best to worst in some absolutely perfect order, but alas, I believe even that is essentially a fool's errand, As fun as it might be to ponder it and throw everything at the problem, trying to come up with the most relatively efficient system for doing so. Anyways, I'm certain I could continue writing this script for hours on end, and I would never really create a comprehensive final take, or hit bedrock, so to speak. I think much like those various divisible elements we use to try to objectively quantify our values of shows, the topic itself is basically infinitely reducible. Hopefully, I've met some balance of making each point full and coherent, and not rambling on with diminishing returns for half of the video. Let me know how I did. So what are some of your favorites? Why do you think they are your favorites? What consistently makes you like or dislike a show? Is it different from genre to genre? Do you prefer straightforward dialogue or subtle subtext? Thematic or technical storytelling? Stories and ideas or presentation? Etc. ad infinitum. Which side of this argument do you stand on? And if you disagree with me, why so? Any input, any questions you've got, drop them in the comments. I may not always reply immediately, but I'll do my best to reply to every single one, as long as it's not super awkward and confusing, at least until the day that it becomes completely untenable. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If you didn't and you're somehow still here, check out my latest review/analysis/first impressions type video. I put a ton of effort into editing those and making them entertaining, and this video is basically just a way to break them up and give me an out for all of my highfalutin, so hopefully you'll enjoy them. Oh, and if you don't hit like and subscribe,
I will eat your ass! That's why I want the globalists to know. I will eat your ass.
Okay, he's not honorable. He is not honorable.
I was going to foot him.
If you press that little bell, a building collapses somewhere, and I don't know why that happens, but that's the way it works.